This is Outside of New York, in-depth discussions with members of the art world who live and work outside of New York. And here's your host, Craig Gould.
Debora Hunter is a Dallas-based photographer who taught art and photography at SMU for 40 years. A native of architecturally rich Oak Park, Illinois, her work reflects an acute awareness of architectural space and the ability to capture the unique characteristics of a specific place. Deborah obtained an undergraduate degree from Northwestern before obtaining her MFA at the Rhode Island School of Design, where she studied under photography giants Harry Callahan and Aaron Siskind. She has been part of group exhibitions at a variety of institutions, including the Amon Carter Museum of American Art, Light Factory, Dallas Museum of Art, Museum of Fine Art Houston, and MOMA, as well as solo exhibitions at the Art Institute of Chicago and the George Eastman House. I recently sat down with Deborah at her home studio in Dallas, where we discussed her childhood writing the L to the Art Institute, the emergence of photography as an area of art study, her love of Taos, planting roots in Dallas, and what it's like to be a classically trained photographer in the age of Instagram. Thank you for joining me and inviting me into your home, which is a beautiful home. Tell me a little bit about this house, because this is, would you call this mid-century modern? Mm-hmm. And the view out the back here doesn't exactly look like what you think of as North Central Texas. I mean, we're on a creek, and there's some cantilevering and things, and so this is a beautiful home. We're fine.
Well, and it's spring right now, and so the treehouse effect is more intense because the leaves are all out on the trees, and the whole wall is glass, and you get to see all the trees at the tree level rather than the trunk level. So right. It's great. I've been thinking as you were coming about my origin story, and it's curious that you should ask me about my house, because architecture is not two-dimensional art, even though I ended up becoming a photographer. It's really architecture, architectural spaces, the way that the spaces relate to each other. And then later on, I became more interested in the landscape. But actually, so much of what I'm interested in started out with architecture and interior spaces and exterior. Sure.
It's funny because I was going to ask you if that was the case just by the nature of where you grew up.
Well, yes. I grew up in a middle class in Oak Park, Illinois. I was actually born in Chicago and lived in an apartment building in a very dense area. And then when I was 7, we moved, my mother and I moved to a hotel in Oak Park, Illinois. And Oak Park is actually, of all of the things that I think had an effect on me as a child, it was walking on those streets. Absolutely. Because those are where all the Frank Lloyd Wright buildings are, all of the Prairie School. We had at that time American elm canopies, and so just being and I didn't come from a family that was educated or read books, but I think just by walking down those streets, walking to school, and I I just absorbed so much. I lived in a hotel. My mother was the manager of it. And so I also and I spent a lot of time alone. And I think that being in an interior space, not having siblings, I had a television, but I didn't have siblings. And then walking to school alone, and even through high school. And then the great thing about where I lived, the other great thing, first of all, it was a community that valued education, and we used to say that Ernest Hemingway had said it's a community of broad lawns and narrow minds, and that's where Ernest Hemingway was born there. And there's
wow.
And so when I was growing up, it was conservative, and of course this was in the 1960s, and youth culture was challenging to so many families or parents when they saw their kids, hippies and so forth. But now Oak Park has really changed, and now lots of artists or families artists who want to raise a family in an interracial community that has beauty that's also adjacent to downtown have chosen Oak Park. So the demographics of Oak Park have totally changed. And if I moved to Chicago and didn't know anything, I might want to live in Oak Park because it's really become a wonderful place. And it was wonderful for sort of different reasons. But the other great thing about Oak Park is that there's an elevated that takes you within 20 minutes, you could be downtown at the Art Institute. So as a child, I would have occasion to ride the L a lot. And now I'm sort of thinking about all these memories that kind of reinforce this idea of architecture and class. So the old L trains, which were, were not air conditioned, and during the summers, the windows would be open, and they would go through narrow corridors where you could actually see into what we didn't call them tenements in Chicago, right, but what I guess would be called tenements in New York. You could see people sitting at tables with bare bulbs, without much, furniture or anything, or they'd be out on, in some cases, the fire escape. Right. And so I saw that there was a whole other half of mostly of people of color that were different from where I lived, and you could see into those houses, those apartments, those families. And it would be dusk or dark, and it'd be lit. It was like Edward Hopper or something. Right. It was really quite interesting to me. And then I would end up downtown, and I would either, for many reasons, walking the streets, the canyons, the light, going to the Art Institute. And I did go to the Art Institute when I was about, I think maybe 12 years old or 13 or 14. I started to take the L by myself, and that would have been a destination point that my mother would have let me go to and to wander around and be in that space.
Right. Mm-hmm. And so the Art Institute is just such a treasure, right? And so do you have specific memories of what attracted you there?
Well, I remember the, now of course it's been enlarged, but I just remember the stairway, and then the all whiteness. And I think there's I don't even know if they had classical sculpture up there when I was growing up. I know now they have architectural fragments of some buildings. I'm trying to recall what was visually what stood out in my mind, what I would remember. They have Monets and all of these impressionists, but I don't think, I would see those, but I don't I can't think about that. I do recall, I think it was Ivan Albright. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He painted, he's a real oddball, and they have some of his work at the Art Institute, and they're like, now I'm trying to exactly remember, but it was like they have portraits, and they're all kind of grotesque or meaty, or not like a Bacon or Freud. But there's a kind of detail of like, now I'm thinking, did they have sores on them or something?
Right.
I can't exactly remember, but I mean, any person would have been captivated as a child, because you would have said, oh, that's sort of that's gross or ugly. Is that person sick or something?
Right.
It was a very particular style, and I think the Art Institute has one or two of them, and they're probably beloved, or at least well known, or just like for me, triggers for me.
Sure.
Of course, there's the lake in Chicago, and there's Buckingham Fountain. So I would have gone and walked around there. And so besides the Art Institute, that whole fountain, the whole public area would have been important to me.
Sure. Yeah. And so you wound up staying relatively close to home when you got ready to go to college. So you went to Northwestern.
Yes.
In Evanston. And so, but you weren't studying art at that point.
Well, when I was in kindergarten, asking me about college, but I'll start at kindergarten.
That's fine.
Yes. I remember that I went to a public school kindergarten, and even before that, I had a little table, a coffee table with a little stool. I still own that stool. And so I used to sit and draw as a child, maybe 4 and 5 years old. Now, I think that all I probably did was use coloring books, or maybe someone gave me a plain piece of manila paper, but more likely I was given a coloring book and a box of crayons. I do kind of remember occasionally kind of doodling around with a line and then filling it in. Right. So, but here's the important thing, is that somehow my mother told me later on in life that my kindergarten teacher had told her that I was talented in art and I should pursue it. It should be pursued. Now, I was never given any special lessons later on. Art was not valued in my family. My mother remembered that, and of course I remembered it. Yeah. And so I do remember sitting at the table and drawing. Okay, then I went to a Catholic grammar school from 1st grade to 8th grade. They had penmanship and religion. They had no science, and they had no art. They had no art at all. So I did not do any art for all those years. Then I went to a public high school, and I took a couple art classes there, and I liked it. But in many ways, I was behind any of the students who had liked art in 8th grade or younger. And so I felt very inadequate. I felt I didn't know how to draw. I didn't know how to paint. But I did become good friends with the person who ended up being our class artist. Right. And I was in art classes with her, and she was the artist, and I was just the tag-along. But she got me to go to the Art Institute in high school and take drawing classes. So I did go on the L for 1 or 2 years to these Saturday morning classes that were offered. And again, I have some of those drawings. They are not remarkable. I don't have much feeling about that. I mean, I think that I felt inadequate, and I think it's important for me, in the way that I understand how I ended up being a photographer, is that I thought art was painting and drawing. That's all or maybe sculpture, but I mean, that was what art was. That's obviously. And I had no talent, but in fact, I hadn't done anything. I had never had instruction. I hadn't had opportunity. Right. And artists were done by men, and I was not a man. And so I never thought of myself as an artist or even thinking about being an artist. Yet, in high school, I thought, boy, I'd kind of like to go do some art, but I thought, oh, I can't do it. I'm not talented. So I ended up going to Northwestern, and I majored in English. And maybe because I like to read novels, and I remember not knowing what I wanted to major in. Right. And I sort of flipped a coin, and I thought, well, I enjoyed these classes.